This week we're going to talk about marriage and families. Arnett actually talks about cohabitation in this chapter, but we've already covered that in the last section, so we won't be talking about that again. And this, you probably are familiar with this evidence by now, but like many things, marriage has also been delayed in more recent generations. So you can see from this graph, the average age of first marriage was 6 years later in 2010 than it was in 1960. Consistently, men are getting married later than women, but the big change here is the change over time. This is looking at the importance of parenthood, being a good parent versus having a successful marriage. And you can see that people who were 18 to 29 in 1997, who are considered Gen X, believed that being a parent was more important than having a successful marriage, but today's millennials, who are in that age range in 2010, there's an even bigger discrepancy. So there's a big emphasis on the importance of parenthood, sometimes to the detriment of marriage. So there's a number of reasons why we're seeing these changes and delays in marriage and parenthood. Better birth control means that people aren't needing to get married to have sex. People are having a lot of sexual relationships before marriage, so there's fewer people who are in a rush. Marriage used to be kind of ideal. Now it's seen as something that emerging adults want, but they first want to gain their independence and develop their career. So they still desire marriage, but it's not the first priority. And the family has kind of changed substantially in the past 50 years or so. Economic pressure and increased consumption and spending means that more women are participating in the labor force, so that has led to substantial changes in the family. There's also been a breakdown of gender-based division of labor, where men and women are much more likely to be doing the same job. Fertility decline, essentially this is a result of improved birth control. So people postpone childbearing because they have better control over their fertility, and we'll come back to this issue. We're also seeing more equality at home and in the workplace, which means that the kind of traditional patriarchal family is changing. And so we're seeing increases in divorce, cohabitation, and non-marital childbearing as well. So certain groups, though, still have this kind of marriage mentality. So this is more common among better educated emerging adults, where before they consider marriage, they want to have more time and experience together, they want to live together, and what we find is that these people tend to have lower rates of marital dissolution. So these people are particularly more likely to be highly educated, and they actually have lower divorce rates. We know less about middle-class marriages, and we also see substantial splits within geography. So people in the South and Midwest tend to marry earlier than people in the Northeast. And we also see communities split by people who either stay in their community, who tend to have lower education and earlier marriage, versus leavers who are going away to college, tend to have more higher degrees and marry later. So there's a big kind of division in the way emerging adults are thinking about marriage. And just like marriage, the trend in parenthood is delayed by several years. So in terms of the average age of first motherhood was 21.5 in 1970. In 2010, it was 25.4. So it's shifted back about 4 years. College-educated women have a greater than 1 in 3 chance of having their first child after age 30. So education pushes this back even more. So there's a couple reasons for this. One is that there's more technology to help women get pregnant later, which means that they can devote time to career and work and worry about kids later once they have that financial stability. And there are benefits for this, right? So kids are in more stable, wealthier households tend to do better at school when they have older parents However, there are also disadvantages for children. Older parents tend to be in what's called a sandwich generation, where they're taking care of their own parents who are aging and their kids at the same time. This also means that grandparents can provide less support in caring for their grandchildren. And there's also higher rates of birth defects when both mothers and fathers are over 35. In particular, ADHD and schizophrenia, there's some evidence that these are associated with older parents. And this is just a snapshot of a news article, but this is a phenomenon that's going on, and we'll talk about this actually again when we talk about older adulthood. But basically, we're seeing birth rates plunging during the recession. So we have a smaller generation that's trying to support a larger aging generation. So we actually have the lowest birth rate since the 1920s, which is the earliest time point when it was reliably recorded. And there's a number of countries that are kind of actively concerned about this, that are developing programs to try to encourage emerging adults to have kids earlier, because they're very concerned about maintaining their populations. So one idea is this idea of kind of cash for babies, so giving families money to help make up for mothers' lost income. Countries like Russia and Hungary have done this. There's mixed results. Another thing that's been proposed as a way to promote parenthood is parental leave for both mothers and fathers. This is really great and might motivate earlier parenthood if these parents are working, but it doesn't really help people who are considering becoming parents while they're in school or graduate school. Parental leave isn't going to help them. And the problem really that you encounter is that the most intense point in an emerging adult's career is probably in their mid to late 20s, which would be ideally when they would be caring for infants, and it's really hard to balance this conflict. And this is just a map of maternity leave, but just to show how the U.S. compares to other countries. This is the amount of paid maternity leave other nations provide. Canada provides 50 weeks, so Europe generally tends to be pretty good, although France and Spain only provide 16 weeks, Japan provides 14, even places like Pakistan provide 12. In the U.S., there is absolutely no mandatory paid maternity leave, and this can have a huge impact on mothers' decisions to take time off and to have children if they can't be paid for that time off. There's also a lot of evidence that paternity leave can have a big impact, so if dads can take time off too. FMLA is the Family Medical Leave Act that guarantees that mothers can take, in the U.S., 12 weeks off. It just doesn't guarantee that they'll get paid for it. Dads are technically covered under it, but there's a big stigma kind of against fathers taking this time off. Another thing we're seeing more and more is single parenthood, in particular single motherhood. So 40% of all first births happen outside of marriage. And we see 50% of young adults with high school education or less are parents in their late teens and early 20s. Historically, those people who get pregnant kind of early on would get married, but now there's not necessarily seen as much of a point of this kind of forced or hasty marriage. So instead, often these younger mothers are kind of turning back to their parents and relying on them. And among low socioeconomic status people, emerging adults are particularly likely to postpone marriage until after childbearing. So what we know is that cohabitation marriage mean emerging adults are more likely to leave home earlier, whereas single parenthood means that emerging adults are actually more likely to leave home later. They need the financial support and childcare help from their parents. And so this is generally positive for 1 to 2 years, but it can be negative if it lasts longer. One interesting note is TAMF, which is the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which is governmental assistance, actually requires co-residence for teen mothers. And so this is to restrict public assistance and assure parental supervision. So the government is actually promoting this idea that teen mothers should stay with their moms or their parents to get more support. And so what we're finding is kind of bonds between sexual partners are kind of weakening, but bonds between families are getting stronger. And this is just kind of some of the evidence about this idea of delayed parenthood. This is looking at changes in values upon entering parenthood, and this looks at the top math and science grad students who are ages 25 to 35. And what they found was that men tend to be more agentic and career-focused in terms of their values, whereas women were more communal and had more holistic values. And they found that gender differences increased over time, so men became more career-focused, whereas women became more relationship-focused over time. And this was particularly true among parents. So for parents, this intensified. Gender differences also intensify or can lead to different representations in terms of high-level and intensive careers, because if dads are focusing on doing well and pursuing risk-taking, pursuing their careers, they're going to do better than mothers who might have shifted their priorities to more family-oriented things. This is a study looking at following a group of participants for 9 years, looking at how or when they decide to become a parent. And what they found was that emotionality in terms of being easily frightened and nervous in new situations decreases the probability of having children. So those who are highly emotional are less likely to have kids, but having kids increases emotionality. We also find that sociability, so preferring to spend time with other people, preferring to work in groups, means that people are more likely to have kids. And kids make sociability more extreme. So if people are initially low in sociability, they become less sociable when they have kids. If it's initially high, they become more sociable. And then finally, this looks at a group of people that they followed from ages 14 to 18, looking at neuroticism, which is related to that idea of emotionality. And what they found was people who were more neurotic were less likely to become parents. But things that predicted parenthood was social support from friends, not from family or the workplace. But this friend support did predict increased likelihood of having kids. Marital status, so being married, made people more likely to become parents. And these were kind of the biggest predictors of who was going to become a parent. So this just kind of adds to the evidence that is talked about in your book and the articles that you've read on this idea of why emerging adults are delaying marriage and parenthood.